taking it from what has been discussed so far, we've looked into two of the main stakeholders in crowdfunding activities, which has been discussed so far, the platforms and also the regulators from the perspective of licensing. So from here, we look into the third group of stakeholders, which is the fundraisers, and looking into some of the claims that crowdfunding concept proclaims to provide. And we look into how crowdfunding has been providing democracy in terms of funding, and we look into in terms of age, gender, and other group of fundraisers. Looking at it from the age perspective, our data provided some interesting insight where we found out that young people are more interested in seeking non-investment and lending mode of funding when it comes to seeking crowdfunding finance for their activities. And also, when you look at it from the perspective of equity, we saw that mainly the matured individuals between the age of 46 and 45, and also beyond 56 and to the age of 65, prefer to seek equity forms of crowdfunding when it comes to raising funding for their activities. One of the main claims of crowdfunding is its democracy when it comes to providing access to funding to male and female. Yet, based on the data that we had for this current study, we found out that men indeed represent majority of fundraisers in most models across the regions that we analyze in this study. And indeed, there's a significant imbalance, mostly in the investment models. And here we found that the large share of female equity fundraisers were represented in Western Europe, which was highlighted around 32%, whilst we found the lowest to be in Southern Europe, which was 3.5%. Also, we found out that the largest share of female borrowers was in Eastern Europe, around 35%, while the lowest was recorded in Western Europe, 18%. Nonetheless, we found an equal distribution of male and female when it comes to non-investment models. And here, mainly we can say that this kind of imbalance in the investment models and the equal distribution in the non-investment models could be associated to the relatively lower risk appetites as found in entrepreneurship literature when it comes to females entrepreneurships and endeavors. Also, looking at the proportion of female investors, we wanted to also explore how the proportion of female investors on one specific platform influences the amount that has been raised on these platforms. That is trying to understand the correlation between the proportion of female fundraisers on the platform and the amount of volumes raised by these specific platforms. And we found out that in equity, the higher share of female fundraisers really leads to higher share of volume raised on these platforms. And in lending, we found out that this effect was relatively significant, but there was a negative correlation between female proportions and the amount of volumes raised by these platforms. When it comes to non-investment, we found a curvilinear effect where the proportion of female investors on these platforms indeed raised their volumes raised by these platforms, but to a certain extent. And here, when the proportion of female fundraisers are beyond 40%, the amount of volumes raised by this platform diminishes accordingly. Also, we look at different type of fundraisers, and here we compared repeat versus one-time fundraisers. And here, repeat are those fundraisers that seek funding for more than one time on the specific platforms. And here, our data revealed that most fundraisers on equity and non-investment platforms were mainly one-time fundraisers, while lending platforms attract more of repeated ones. And here, the main underlying reason to this finding was that lending model fundraisers, mainly in property lending, seek more than one-time rounds, which is merely the kind of sometimes classified as trenches, where when the initial loan is being paid, the lenders then initiate a second round or probably a third round of loans that is given to these fundraisers. This justifies the reasons why repeat fundraisers are more identified in lending models. Also, we found out that share of repeat borrowers, especially in Northern Europe, was really high, which stood at 94.7%, but the lowest was also recorded in Eastern Europe, 28.2%. Additionally, we found that the highest share of repeat fundraisers was in equity in Western Europe, which stood at 60.3%, but the lowest was in Eastern Europe at 10.5%. And lastly, when it comes to this form of repeat versus one-time investors, we found out that the highest share of repeat fundraisers in non-investment models was recorded in Eastern Europe, which stood at 61.6%, and the lowest was 2.3%. Also, we look into fundraisers by type. Here, we define fundraisers into 5 main categories, which include large enterprises, SMEs, micro entrepreneurs, non-profit, and individual entrepreneurs. And we look at this across regions. And here, our data reveal that SMEs fundraisers dominate equity models by having the higher share mostly in Southern Europe, which stood at 92.5%, but in Northern Europe was 58.1%. Also, SMEs dominated the lending model across regions, with the highest share in Western Europe at 67.1%, and the lowest was in Eastern Europe, 22.1%. When it comes to non-investment platforms, the highest share of non-profit organizations among the fundraisers was the highest, especially in Southern Europe, and the lowest was recorded in Northern Europe. Also, we look into the proportion of SMEs fundraisers on these platforms and how it influences the volumes raised on these platforms. We wanted to explore whether there's any form of correlation between this type of fundraisers and the amount of volumes raised on these platforms. Indeed, we found that in equity, there was a positive correlation between the proportion of SME fundraisers, yet that was a very weak effect, as we identified in the figures here. Also in lending, we found out that volume increases as and when SME fundraisers increases on the platform, but it declines when this proportion goes beyond 65%. Finally, we found out that in non-investment platforms, the higher the proportion of SMEs fundraisers, the lower the volumes that are raised on these platforms. Also, we look at, based on models in 2022 specifically, we look at the average number of fundraisers on platforms that we analyze. And across models, we found out that 49% of platforms had less than 51 fundraisers in 2022. And also around 17% of platforms recorded more than 500 fundraisers in 2022. Nonetheless, we saw that non-investment models recorded higher number of fundraisers. Nevertheless, these fundraisers requested minimum and not substantially higher amount, which also led to the lower volumes raised on this kind of platforms. We also look into onboarding and success of these campaigns raised on these platforms. And here, onboarding means campaigns that were approved by these platforms, and success here indicate the chances of this campaign raising the amount that they requested. And when we look at equity, we can see that despite the lower approval rate, that's onboarding rate, which stood at 10%, the success rate was really high, 92%. And this applies also in lending, where approval rate was around 16% in 2021 and 13% in 2022, yet success rate was really high, which was between 98 and 99%. Nonetheless, looking at it from non-investment perspective, in our data, we identify some outliers, and therefore we did our analysis not on the model, but at the regional level. Looking at it from the regional level, we found that the highest onboarding rate was recorded in Eastern Europe, while the lowest was in the Northern Europe. And here, as you can see, in Eastern Europe, we had approved campaigns that ranged, that was in around 93% in 2021, and 86% in 2022, which all recorded very high success rates. Yet, when you look at the lowest onboarding rate in Northern Europe, considering the outliers, we can see that in 2021, there was onboarding rate around 27%, 2022 recorded 31%. And when we do away with the outliers, we can still see that success rate was around 49%, and that dropped to 27% yet in 2022. But nonetheless, this also indicates that there are high chances of campaigns getting successful compared to other traditional modes of providing funds. Also, success rate was highest in Eastern Europe, as I identified, and Northern Europe was the lowest in the region that we considered in this current study.